Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our second day of the Ojai Festival and these Ojai talks. It's a joy to be joined once again by our music director, Jeremy Denk. The subject of the day is a hero musician and scholar, thinker about music. I know very much a role model and friend of Jeremy's, and for me as well from my youngest days as a student. Here's my very dog-eared, yellow highlighted copy, carefully written that I bought it in 1975, of Charles Rosen's The Classical Style. And now for generations of music students and music lovers, this is a book that provides such deep, ear-opening insight into the workings of the music of Beethoven, Haydn, and Mozart. And as I think all of you know, tonight we'll see the world premiere of a new opera with a libretto by Jeremy Denk, inspired by an idea of Jeremy's, on the classical style, with music composed by Stephen Stuckey, who we'll meet at the end of this afternoon's time together and talk about the writing of the opera. The opera celebrates, first of all, I think Jeremy's admiration. And Mike, do I have the slide of the photo? Here's a very lovely photo of Jeremy and Charles Rosen playing four hands at the piano. So it grows out of a very meaningful personal friendship that lasted about 5 years, I think, the last 5 years of Charles Rosen's life. And the opera, which I've had the privilege of seeing the dress rehearsal, and some of you may have had the same opportunity as well, has Charles Rosen as a character, as a central character. It also has Beethoven, Mozart, and Haydn as characters, as you might expect in an opera about this book. But it also has Donna Anna from Don Giovanni, the Commendatore from Don Giovanni himself.
It's worth refreshing your knowledge of the first scene of Don Giovanni for maximum enjoyment. Yeah.
Robert Schumann makes a very touching and meaningful cameo appearance at the end in ways we'll talk about. And I think all of that will be fairly clear to you. But what may be less apparent are three fairly memorable characters who bear the names tonic, dominant, and subdominant, who each have very distinct psyches that are reflective of their role within classical harmony. And we thought that there'd be no better place to start than to have Jeremy introduce to you three of his leading characters, tonic, dominant, subdominant, and to explain to you how they came to their psychic states.
Well, I mean, many people will get a little alarmed by these technical terms. Maybe not the nerdier among you, but the normal, innocent listener. And Charles himself, in the course of the opera, explains this new something in the classical style that was different from what happened before, which is a new kind of emphatic polarity between the tonic and the dominant, and how that became such an important part of the style. You know, if you don't know the terms tonic and dominant, you still know, of course, what tonic and dominant are. You're living it right now. Almost anything you've ever listened to is completely consumed with it. And tonic, dominant, or that's the tonic. To the dominant. Rum, rum, da-dee, da-dee, da-dee. Back to the tonic, or tonic. To the dominant, staying on the dominant. back to the tonic. The tonic is the home key of the piece, and the dominant, of course, is the chord built on the 5th scale degree. 1, 2, 3, do. What are the? Do, re, mi, fa, sol. And you build a chord on there, and that chord, of course, always wants to go to. Or if you add the 7th, even more it wants to go there because those two notes really, really, really want to. And you know, I could go a bazillion examples, like Eroica Symphony. Tonic, dominant, dominant, tonic, tonic, dominant, tonic. I mean, they built a whole empire on this ridiculous thing. And maybe my favorite example altogether in all of music is this last movement of Opus 109, Beethoven, which is, I remember a theorist once said, it's like Beethoven stares at you in the face very intently and beautifully and says, tonic goes to dominant. One go too far. Tonic goes to the dominant. Tonic goes to the dominant. Tonic goes to the dominant. Yeah? And this incredible theme. Yeah. This incredible theme of just unbelievable transcendental beauty is made of kind of the most idiotic harmonic scheme imaginable. And yet, yeah, so somehow they built this tremendous language on these two chords. And so I decided they should be opera buffa characters in their own right. And the tonic being the home key and very settled and comfortable, the sense that we've arrived, he's a fairly narcissistic individual, as you may find, and he's a bit of a one-note wonder also. And the poor dominant who we run across is always wanting to resolve to the tonic. And so she has a very sad, sort of high-maintenance aria where she laments her inability to resolve. And Steve wrote the most brilliantly funny kind of, because every time she says resolve, or he does something in the bass so that it doesn't resolve. And there's all these millions of deceptive cadences, and then it says, it sounds like a cliche, she says, and he does the most cliched imaginable harmonic motion under that. So there's a lot of that kind of insider musical humor. And then, so the tonic and the dominant are always arguing because they're in this emphatic polarity that defines the classical style. And then I wanted the subdominant, as Charles says.
You should
introduce. Oh yeah, I should, yeah. So whoa. Am I still on? Yeah. If, for the sake of argument, we're in C major, and why not? And the dominant is G major. If I put a nice in my C major, that takes us sort of backwards down the circle of fifths to the subdominant. And it so happens it's a favorite trick of Mozart's in the last section of a sonata form, after all the rivalry between the tonic and the dominant and all the tension and whatever stuff happens, that he suddenly moves into the subdominant and it releases all the energy and the sort of drive of the piece into this, and it has this tremendous serenity. And so I created this sort of earth goddess, earth mother character who comes in the middle, destroying the argument, and suddenly the tonic, of course. Now this is really nerdy. Of course, the tonic is actually the dominant of the subdominant. Because everything's, that's how music theory is. And so the tonic immediately finds himself attracted to the subdominant in the same way that the dominant is attracted to the tonic. And so it becomes this codependent love triangle situation, and that is the short explanation of that, for some mystifying scene. But I hope you'll enjoy this kind of, it's like Theory 101 made into an opera, which is, it's never been attempted before. But the thing is that Mozart uses all these harmonies in exactly this way to paint his characters as either settled or agitated, or, and so I'm just making a little bit explicit what's already implicit, I guess. Yeah.
After I heard it, I thought, this should be offered in all basic theory courses because it makes it quite immediate, the color and function of these chords within tonal harmony. And you should also know that the scene, the primary scene with the three of them is set in a bar. So I'm not going to give away the most irresistible joke of the opera, but when it comes, you'll know.
Is that the most irresistible joke? I'm
Well,
very depressed now.
You didn't resist it.
I didn't resist it, that's true. I didn't resist it.
Let's just say it's a groaner.
Yeah. There are many deliberate groaners, it must be admitted.
But what's lovely about this piece is that in a very witty piece, it touches on, I think, the strength of this remarkable book. And maybe we should take a minute talking about it. We listen to these pieces for affect and the draw and the power and the sensuality and every other dimension that these extraordinary pieces have on us and why they've endured and connect with succeeding generations of listeners and musicians. And what Charles Rosen did in a way that very few writers about music have done is describe how the workings of the music lead to that affect. Much music theory writing looks like set theory or some sort of mathematical analysis. It's about a non-living thing, and it's sort of paper thinking. And what Rosen's genius in this book is that he connects the theory to the ear and then to the mind and the heart, and his prose is extraordinary. So even if you can't make your way through the musical examples, reading it for the descriptive prose, I think, is worthwhile. I'd be curious for your take when you suggest this book to friends, whether musicians or music lovers who may not have theoretical backgrounds. What do you suggest? How do you suggest they go at it?
Charles he makes some effort to be accessible, but not always. And if you're a general reader and you don't read music, for example, there are some large passages that are not going to be accessible. And it's kind of amazing that a book like this, in a way, got published and had such a huge, because it's fairly wonky, and that's part of the raison d'etre of the opera, is to sort of bring to life this thing. But you're right, the descriptive passages where Charles connects, late Beethoven, what Beethoven did to the language, or there's one that I picked in the opera that is so extraordinary about the relationship between grief and sensuality in Mozart. And that always at the moments of greatest tragedy in Mozart, there is also this kind of implicit, kind of luscious sensuality or even sexuality, and that those two don't conflict with each other, but they kind of weirdly strengthen each other. And the music is so seductive and so tragic at the same time. And Steve very subtly and elegantly supplies the exact perfect musical examples while Charles tells this greatness of Mozart. And he plays the little moments from Don Giovanni, and you're like, yes, that is it, exactly. Don Giovanni being, of course, one of the more sexed up of operas. But that's the thing, when Charles is speaking so profound. There's another one in the last scene that we picked about. But you were saying your favorite one is the one about Brahms at the very end.
Oh.
Of it. Yeah.
Well, let me just do a little digression. This is an example. This is in the very last page of the book. And there's a little throwaway line about Brahms. The classical style is wound down, and he's talking about its effect on succeeding generations of composers, and we'll talk a minute about the profound effect on Schumann and Schumann's commentary on the classical style. And so it's just this kind of conclusion and looking forward. And he says, I'm just going to skip through it. A style, when it is no longer the natural mode of expression, gains a new life, a shadowy life in death, as a prolongation of the past. We imagine ourselves able to revive the past through its art, to perpetuate it by continuing to work within its conventions. For this illusion of reliving history, the style must be prevented from becoming truly alive once again, which is exactly where the opera begins. Mozart, Beethoven, and Haydn are in heaven and incredibly frustrated that they've become these dead plaster busts on top of the piano and are no longer living. And they begin this quest to find this man, Charles Rosen, who really understands them and can help bring them back to life.
That's the plot of the opera, such as it is. Yeah.
And here's the two sentences about Brahms, which I think are more valuable than any 36 books about Brahms. The sense of the irrecoverable past, however, is omnipresent in the music of Brahms, resignedly eclectic, ambiguous without irony. The depth of his feeling of loss gave an intensity to Brahms's work that no other imitator of the classical tradition ever reached. He may be said to have made music out of his openly expressed regret that he was born too late.
Charles, give it up for Charles. Yeah. Amazing.
You know, that's 3 sentences about Brahms in the context of another book that is so deeply insightful on the tug and the pull of Brahms's music. That it's very much representative of the book. One fascinating thing about the book is that it was, I think it first came out in 1971, and in 1972 it won the National Book Award. Which is immensely rare for any book about music or music criticism or anything like that. Yeah. And the other interesting thing about it is that initially, at least, a lot of the scholarly and musicological establishment didn't even particularly pay attention or regard the book. It was never reviewed originally in the Journal of the American Musicological Society because it was a book by a pianist. It wasn't a serious scholarly book.
Reminds me that there's a famous saying by Randall Jarrell about that. He says, it's like a pig judging a bacon contest. Do you know what I mean? What does that pig know about bacon? You know? And that's how sometimes how musicologists feel about musicians sometimes, and vice versa.
And Jeremy allows his revenge on the topic because the other character we didn't mention is a PhD musicology student named Henry Snibblesworth, who is a memorable character in the opera, and I don't think he needs further explanation.
No, because he explains himself at great length, sadly. And everything else that happens, yeah.
The book and the opera come to a close with a not very long but deeply moving description of Schumann's Fantasy in C major. And the origin of the piece is that Liszt was trying to enlist other composers to raise money for a monument to Beethoven, for each of them to write a piece that would then be sold and be a kind of charity effort to raise money for the statue to Beethoven or a monument to Beethoven. And as Charles has said memorably, the piece Schumann himself wrote is probably the most moving monument to Beethoven. And we're going to end this segment.
Wait, let me just say one short thing before you do that, because it's important to know that the Schumann Fantasy is built on a particular Beethoven quote.
Well, no, I was going to
You were going to do that.
No, you're the pianist. I was going to ask you to do that.
Yeah. There's the last song, or not the last, but the second to last song of An die ferne Geliebte of Beethoven. to forget it now. So the main and Schumann rewrites it like this. You hear the connection? And he goes a. And you can almost feel the classical style dying at that very moment in a weird way. And this new, no, I mean, not serious, very seriously, and very kind of the emergence of this romantic other world. Yeah, so.
And so what we have for you is a video of a concert performance given by Charles Rosen of the original version of the Schumann Fantasy. And we'll just watch the first movement, which ends with the quote that Jeremy just played for you, and you will next encounter it tonight. And I hope it will be meaningful to you to see Charles Rosen himself in a piece he loved deeply and championed endlessly and wrote about so eloquently. And this opera pays homage to his love for this piece and his recognition of its importance. So we're going to, I think you'll stay and watch.
Oh, absolutely.
But Jeremy, after this, will go off to his tasks of the day. So before we let him go off completely, I just wanted to thank him again. If we can turn the lights off, that would be great.
I'd particularly like to say a few words about the fantasy because I'm playing the version which is not called the fantasy in C major, but a version called Dichtungen für das Pianoforte, that is poems for the piano. And it's the manuscript in Budapest that was discovered by Alan Walker a few years ago. And it's natural that the manuscript of the Schumann Fantasy should be in Budapest because it was written at the request of Liszt, and it must have gotten somehow into Liszt's archives. And the manuscript is different in one important respect. There are a few details, a few notes added, and a few things that I keep. But the last page is very different and goes back to the end of the first movement. And it's such a beautiful ending, and a pity that Schumann cut it out, that having seen it, I really refuse to give it up. And the manuscript also has titles for the different movements, which is a help in performance. The first movement is called Ruins, and the second movement is called Triumphal Arch, and the third movement is called Constellation. And the whole piece was written at the request of Liszt in order to raise money by selling the pieces of various composers that Liszt asked, to sell money, to get money for a monument to Beethoven. And in fact, the last page of the first movement and the last page of the version I'm playing both contain a quotation from Beethoven's An die ferne Geliebte, to the distant beloved. And this is particularly interesting musically because the whole first movement is based on the theme by Beethoven that you only hear in its original form at the end, but you will hear echoes of it throughout the entire first movement. And fragments of it appear falling to ruins almost, if you want to put it that way. And the reappearance at the end as a kind of memory, which it is in the Beethoven. In the Beethoven, it is a memory that returns of the first song. And the Liszt is really recalling the entire Beethoven song cycle. Schumann is recalling the entire Beethoven song cycle. And so that is the version I'm going to play this evening.
the concert took place in 1985 in Atlanta, Georgia, and this is wonderful, wonderful document. And the man who had the foresight to record it, the entire recital, and it includes an interview with Charles Rosen as well, as a man named Frank Bell, who did it as a labor of love. And as best as I could find online, the DVD remains available. He has a company called thevirtuosopianist.org, which is still an active website, and it's listed as for sale. So if you'd like to see the entire recital, it would be lovely to make sure that this precious document continues to have a life. We'll now turn to the second portion of our time together this afternoon, and it's my privilege to invite up three very different perspectives on Charles Rosen and his work. Please welcome Don Randall, Henry Zerner, and Timo Andres. Hello. Oop.
That's okay.
Yes.
So just, you want to tell them when we get to the break that we'll just have a 20-minute?
Let me begin introductions with, to your right. Don Randall is most recently just retired as president of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, where he had such tremendous positive effect on American philanthropy and also wise philanthropy in the arts as well. Prior to that, he was the president of the University of Chicago, and prior to that, he was provost at Cornell University. But he's a musicologist. I shouldn't neglect to mention that. And for students of various generations, our standard reference work was the Harvard Dictionary of Music, edited by Don Randall. So it is in his role, among the multiple roles he's played in his distinguished career as a musicologist and friend and understanding perspective on Charles Rosen that we greet him today. Timo Andres is a pianist and composer who came out of the very lively composition program at the Yale School of Music. And we have the good fortune of hearing at least two pieces of Timo's this weekend. His rethinking of Mozart's Coronation Concerto, or his perspective on Mozart's Coronation Concerto, which, whether it was intended or not, sheds extraordinary light on some of the very issues that Charles Rosen talks about in the classical style and the pull of tonality and tonal direction. And to my immediate left is Henry Zerner, who was a lifelong friend of Charles Rosen's and frequent collaborator in a number of scholarly works that they did together. Henry is professor of the history of art and architecture at Harvard University. And Henry, you have pride of place. Just before we came up, I said, how long did you know Charles? And the answer is worth hearing. Could you grab the mic from, we're going to share two mics among three.
So I met him in 1950.
Oh.
It's not on, okay.
Switch mics? Yeah, let's try the one Don has. Yes. No, take the one Don has.
This one doesn't work?
Ah, good, okay.
I'm not as stupid as you. I met him, my memory is
Can you
correct,
hold it closer?
in 1949, when I was 10 years old. And I am told that it was a friend of my mother's,
had become recently a friend of my mother's, and I'm told that he took me. My mother was a single mother. My father died, and she was very busy, and he kindly took me to the zoo. And I'm told that I came back, and I was asked how it was, and I said he was very intelligent. I'm glad you grasped the humor. And I can't even tell you what we talked about.
Just hold it closer.
Because I'm sorry, I'm not used to holding the mic so close. He had recently completed his PhD at Princeton University, which was on La Fontaine, the fabulous French author, and being a French schoolboy, 10 years old, that's one author I really knew reasonably well by heart. So we had something to talk about. It was the Fables of La Fontaine. And I guess he talked about it very well. You can read the dissertation if you go to Princeton. So that's how long I have known him, but we became, he became then a close friend of my mother's, and then when I was of age, really by 1955, we became very close. And by then I was 16, and he stayed actually with us in Paris for several years in my mother's apartment. So then, the rest of my life, the rest of our lives were very closely tied together.
You've put together a very beautiful personal photo album, which if we could take a look at.
I've put together some of photos that are perfectly well known, but this is the end.
So we need to somehow get to the beginning.
Can we get back to the beginning?
There we go. Okay. And if we can turn the lights off again for a moment, just to see
if you
better.
could, so that you can see the pictures a little better, maybe. So this is the classical style, since this is what we are talking about, and as you can see, this is only a few of the various avatars of that book, which was translated in God knows how many languages and went through heaven knows how many editions, and is still available, and you can buy it at a stand at the festival. Can we have the next? What I've done is to, in a few images, to go back in Charles's life. And this is one of the last pictures which I took myself, I believe, and in the very last part of his life, when he was basically expected to die of cancer, as a sort of view of eternity, as you can see. There's to me, a great deal of pathos in that, but even in his late days, he was often more not so anguished. Can we have the next? And you can see him much more cheerful. I wanted to show you this one because this is at home at the piano, which Jeremy knows well and will recognize the sort of messy, casual aspect of the setting in New York. The next one, if you have any questions, of course.
No, please.
So this is just to give a sense of the expressiveness of his face, and which I'm sure you saw also in those videos where the expressiveness is quite clear. I particularly like the sort of meditative one in the pose of melancholy on the left, which is very nice. That's I don't know who took that photograph, but the others are taken by a very old friend, Catherine Temerson, who was the daughter of the first violin of the New York Symphony. He was a very close friend of Charles. They often played together. Next. Now, I couldn't resist because this is one of my favorite pictures, and it's Charles with my mother, who was a wonderful woman. As you can see, he was a very dashing, at that point, very dashing young man. This must be in the second part of the 50s, the 1950s. He is in his late 20s at this point, and you can see why I was very taken with him. Next, this is to me, a very funny photograph. I found it recently buried in a drawer, and it is in bad shape, you can see. But it must have been taken as a picture for publicity. You see him coming out of a plane, and it was taken when he was touring with the Seventh Army Symphony throughout Europe. This was a part of the post-war, I suspect in 51 or 52, and they went all over Europe playing various concertos. And Air France must have thought it was a good idea, good publicity. I doubt that they actually used it. Next, this is a photo. This is clearly a professional photograph of Charles when he was, I think, probably about 14, and at a time when he was a pupil. He studied with Rosenthal, and that was great. Certainly those pictures were taken because there was great hope of, and as a sort of curiosity, Rosenthal had agreed, and his wife had agreed to teach him free, but with the understanding that if he had a great career as a prodigy, they would get 15%. I have actually found the contract at the bottom of a drawer. His parents didn't want him to do that, so it never happened. So the Rosenthals were out of it. But Charles remained very, very extremely grateful to their tutoring, and they were not recompensed in money, but they were recompensed in feeling and gratitude, which might not have been their choice. Well, we get back to the very beginning next. And this is the four people at the right are his father and his mother, Anita, who was a very beautiful woman who was an aspiring actress. It never happened. Her career and the two boys are Charles and his brother, his slightly younger brother, Donald, who was a very distinguished, brilliant biologist who was the curator of fish at the Museum of Natural History in New York, whom I knew very well, and who very sadly died quite young of a brain tumor. But he remained a great, a real name in the world of biology. He was also a paleontologist and as well as a biologist. And so there they are. And his father, whom you see on the right, who was very much older than his mother. They were about 20 years apart. And Charles didn't like his father very much. Actually, but he was very attached to his mother, who was quite young, had Parkinson's disease, and died fairly young. Well, can we have the next? So I think it's interesting to see how out of this little little brat comes the Charles Rosen, who is part of history. And so a couple more images next. This is Elizabeth Sifton on the left, and on the right, George Braziller. They're both, George Braziller was a publisher, and Elizabeth Sifton is still a major editor, very distinguished, a wonderful woman. She's also the daughter of Niebuhr, the theologian, and great lady. And I wanted to say a few words maybe about how the classical style came about. Charles was trained in literature, but he had never had any intention of having a career as a literary scholar. He always knew he was a pianist, and but when he did quite a few recordings in the 50s and 60s, and especially the 50s, and he was appalled by the jacket notes, which he thought were just unbelievably idiotic, and telling you about, this is sad because Mozart had just lost his mother, and junk like that. So he decided he would write his own jacket notes, which he did. And then we had a friend who was a friend of mine, actually, who was the wife of an art historian, museum director called Daniel Robbins, who was at one time director of the School of Design Museum in Rhode Island, and then the Fog Art Museum, and a very remarkable scholar of modern art. And his wife was an editor at Braziller's. And she told Braziller he really should ask Charles to write a book. So Braziller had him to lunch and said, I want to publish a book by you, and I'll publish anything you want to write. So Charles thought about it, and he decided he was going to write a book called The Classical Style in Music. And I think that was it. I have the contract somewhere. And then about 2.5 years later, you received a letter. Braziller was a very strange man. He was very unpredictable, and the editors changed very fast. Very few people lasted more than 6 months. So my friend was long out, and some new young editor found the contract and wrote him a letter saying, in view of the fact that it's been 2.5 years, the contract was signed in 1964. 2.5 years later, letter in the mail saying, since we haven't heard anything, we suggest that you return the advance, which I think was $500. So, which in the time was not nothing, but, and Charles was having lunch with Aaron Asher, who was a very distinguished editor of literary. He was the editor of Saul Bellows and a number of major writers at the time at Vikings. And he said, well, that's fine. You return the advance, cancel the contract, and we'll double the advance. Which is exactly what he did. He didn't call them or anything, just returned the money, and that's how it went to Viking. And Aaron Asher was the first editor, but then Aaron Asher left Viking, and Elizabeth Sifton took over, and she was a wonderful editor as well, and she also was the editor of the book called Romanticism and Realism, which we wrote together. So I've worked with her. I can tell you there is no better editor that I can think of. So this is how this is the story of how it came about, and then it got the book award to everybody's surprise, because it's not the kind of books that normally gets the award. And actually, I can't resist. We had not exactly a friend, but somebody who was a friend of friends, John Simon, who wrote, and he was nominated for the award as well. And he encountered Charles, and he said he had an accent because he was from Yugoslavia. And he said, "Charles, congratulations for beating me." And Charles said, "Oh, think nothing of it, John. It was easy." We didn't like him very much. So I think that's enough anecdotes about this now legendary book.
Well, and I think there are one or two more pictures.
And then there are a couple more pictures. So next. These are, I wanted to show you the picture on the upper right, because that is Frank Bell in the middle, who produced these wonderful videos, and also did a terrific recording of a concert that Charles played there in, I think, 1995 or 98. And Charles wanted to actually publish two of the pieces because he felt he had never played as well ever. So these will probably, I'm seeing somebody in New York, and these will be made available to the public. They are the Waldstein Sonata of Beethoven and the Brahms Paganini variations, which is one of the most insanely difficult pieces for the piano. And down below is a picture with Fred Sherry, who is with us. He may not be here right now, but he was.
Fred, are you here? No.
No.
Fred is here at the festival.
He's at the festival, but yeah.
The cellist in that picture.
The cellist in that picture was very close friend of Charles and also of Elliott Carter. And the last two pictures I wanted to show, which are probably better known, are Charles with the two composers who were major figures in his life and career. Elliott Carter on the left, and Pierre Boulez on the right, two major figures whom he was associated with with Elliott Carter for a very long time, that is, since the first performance of the double concerto for piano and harpsichord, which that Charles gave the first performance of with Ralph Kirkpatrick as the harpsichord, and he was, of course, very closely associated with Elliott Carter until the latter's death about 2 months before his own. And Pierre Boulez, with whom he collaborated very intensively, but for a much shorter period. But he did record some major works of Boulez. So much for
that's the last of the pictures, and thank you, Henry,
yes,
for bringing it, if we can have the lights back up. I wanted to ask, Jeremy and I touched on it a little bit. Charles had this classical style, as you heard, was his first book, and a remarkable first book. Unfortunately, it was followed by a number of others. And there was this interesting split, not within himself, but within the musical world of where we don't take easily to people who do multiple things extraordinarily well, and we want to categorize. And I wondered if he ever felt pained as his work as a pianist being dismissed because he was thought to be a scholar, or his work as a scholar being dismissed because he was thought to be a pianist. Did he feel this split whatsoever, either internally or externally? Yeah, no, it's...
Is this still?
Yeah.
Yes. He was not at all concerned about being dismissed as a scholar. He couldn't care less. He did dislike being thought of as a scholar who played the piano. I mean, he thought absolutely of himself as a pianist who thought about music and was able to write about it. I think that's a simple answer. Maybe I might add that one might also feel that, you know, there's a sort of break between these contemporary composers and the fact that he played mostly and the classical music. The fact is that actually originally he was thought of as a specialist in the French music of the early 20th. He did the first performance of the complete performance of the first complete recording of the Debussy etudes, actually, and that was mostly what he was famous for at the beginning of his career. He also recorded some contemporary people who were around him. Martineau happened to be at Princeton at the time, so he recorded Martineau with, I think, in his own apartment. That was, I think, his first recording, public.
That's the Czech composer Bohuslav Martineau, who taught at Princeton at the time. Charles Rosen was getting his doctorate, not in music. In case you missed that, his doctorate was in French literature. Although
he was very close to the music. It was a great music department because Milton Babbitt was there already, and also some of his colleagues like Ken Levy became very major musicologists, and he remained quite close to Ken Levy and Michael Steinberg for many years.
Don, I'm sure you remember the arrival of the book, and I wonder if you'll recall for us how it was greeted at the time and how the view of the book has perhaps shifted in the 40 years since its publication.
Well, I should begin by taking up with a remark Henry made. Charles was very intelligent. But he was not only that, he knew Haydn, Beethoven, Mozart forward and backward intimately as a performer, but also he knew all the scholarly literature about this, going back into the 19th century. In addition, he knew Dittersdorf and Stamitz and a bunch of minor composers whom we barely remember in the 18th century. The book comes out, and it was, to many people, shocking. There was a minor industry in musicology of the study of musical styles. And here Charles came along and said, the style was the product of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven, the greatest creators of the period, made in some degree out of the works of many lesser composers, but the definition of the classical style was something that was created by these three great composers. And he furthermore could say, this really came about in about 1780 with the Opus 33 quartets of Haydn and K271 E-flat piano concerto by Mozart. And the book talks hardly at all about the vast sea of lesser composers that musicologists of the day were very busy grinding out dissertations about. Well, so this already upset some number of people. Then he proceeded to ground the whole notion of the classical style in this polarity between tonic and dominant about which Jeremy was speaking. And so it had a deeply rooted theoretical underpinning, and he shows in that book that he knew the most advanced kind of musical analysis by people like Heinrich Schenker, who was much in vogue in the academy. So he not only knew history, but went against the tradition of studying the vast sea of the underpinnings, but rather went straight to the three great geniuses. He rooted it in this very important notion about theory. That went along with a view of sonata form, about which he also had very clear opinions, starting with the fact that what most people are taught in music appreciation about sonata form is really fundamentally wrong. How many of you know that there's a first masculine theme followed by a second lyrical feminine theme, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And he shows on the basis of many, many works that this is just nonsense. This is no way to account for sonata form. So that was another great ripple. And then finally, I guess, the shocking thing was to say that Beethoven was one of the definers of the classical style and was not the first romantic. Well, the standard textbook account was Beethoven was the romantic hero. He was the Slav living in an attic and going against so forth and so on. Whereas Charles showed that Beethoven's music was really deeply rooted in the classical style, and that it marked the end of this great period and was not the beginning of what came later with Schumann and many other composers, but rather it defined the end of a great style from which the later composers had departed quite significantly. So there were at least those three big points that sort of shocked a lot of people in musicology. Add to which, of course, he was really a very considerable pianist. And it has to be said, one can't think right away of anyone else, of his accomplishment as both a pianist and as a scholar, who knew every bit as much as the musicologist knew, and who could also play all those pieces very well and could speak about them with real authority. Add to that, of course, he had a wonderful literary gift. The writing in this book is, at moments, nothing short of brilliant. It's, on occasion, opinionated, you'd have to say, but that opinion is always rooted in some real knowledge of the facts of the case. So I'll give you just one little example. There are several numbers sprinkled through the book that were calculated to upset various kinds of people. So one of the big debates was, in a Mozart concerto, should the pianist be playing sort of continuo-like accompaniment when the orchestra is playing? And there are some Mozart manuscripts that have the numbers, the figured bass numbers under them that might suggest this. And Charles says, playing continuo with a Mozart concerto is perfectly acceptable so long as it is not audible. And he had strong opinions about some number of pieces which were either appallingly uninteresting. I mean, he was capable of dismissing certain kinds of things, but you always knew that it was really rooted in something and was not just mere opinion.
One of my favorite things, this is the paperback version of the original edition, as I said, from the 1970s. In the late 90s, was it, Henry? The revised edition came out, something like that. Yeah, yes, Don and I can model each edition for you.
I have mine here. I must say, I will put it in my will because it's inscribed to me by Charles himself.
There's a long preface to the revised edition, and it's very engaging to read because Charles answers 20-some years of critics of the book in the preface, and it's a very long preface. And
Yes, well, so many people had things to say about this, and some of what's in that preface actually started in my living room in Ithaca, New York, when Charles would visit us at Cornell. And there we had very lively conversations with a younger colleague, contemporary of mine, essentially, James Webster. And there's much in the preface about what Jim had to say about that book. And in our living room after dinner, he and Jim would go at it. Jim was also a guy, not a performer or anything like Charles or a performer at all, but who really knew this repertory. And so he and Charles would have these conversations in which one or the other of them would say, oh, but wait a minute, the recapitulation of Opus 33, number 2, and so, I mean, they just had this music like this. And then Jim wrote a book called The Farewell Symphony of Haydn and the Classical Style, in which he took Charles to task for having said that it only started in 1780 and they didn't pay enough attention to the earlier Haydn pieces and so forth. But various other people tried to pile on. A certain amount was said about his view of opera. So Charles had the view that underlying the Mozart operas was this tonic dominant polarity, deeply rooted in sonata form as Charles understood it and explained it. And there were a number of scholars who said that the operas don't really behave this way. There isn't long-term, large-scale structure of the kind that Charles found there.
How has its reception changed over the years? Is it in scholarly circles? Is it now accepted to some degree as a central work?
Well, I think there's no question that it must be reckoned with till this day. People probably don't argue about it quite as much as they did for a time. There was a somewhat new turn in musicology in the 90s toward all kinds of things you will know from other humanistic fields, gender studies, all sorts of things about how music is the expression of somebody's ethnicity or cultural background. And Charles was much more interested in musical structure and not interested in sort of inventing stories about how this music comes out of some particular cultural moment.
How much do you think his life as a performer, as somebody who lived in realizing these pieces and in the sound world of these pieces and these pieces over time, rather than, as living sonic experiences over time, as opposed to score study, informs his perspective in this book?
Well, I think it derives both his scholarly study of this music and his performance of it derives from something deeper that the two have in common, namely this intelligence, or whatever we should call it. I mean, after all, there are very many, we would say, quite gifted performers who really don't have anything much or at all to say about the music that they play. I mean, they're, with all due respect and affection, some very hot performers are essentially athletes of a kind. And Charles was deeply thoughtful as a pianist. And so I think you couldn't separate in his life the scholar from the performer. It was a kind of intelligence that thought of his ability to perform as an expression of the very same intelligence that enabled him to write a stunningly stimulating book.
Among the many memorable passages in the book are studies of Mozart piano concertos and the dramatic progression as a result of the harmonic progression and the kinds of tensions that Jeremy spoke about, and the almost operatic or theatrical progression of events in a piano concerto as rooted in both structure and harmonic progression. And in a really brilliant stroke of programming, the festival this year includes a piece that comments brilliantly on that very topic, and in a way that I'm sure you never expected, Timo, when you wrote the piece, becomes a kind of perfect commentary about the classical style. It is a realization that Timo made, and I'll ask him to explain what the original source is and what he did to it in a second, of Mozart's 26th piano concerto in the common numbering concerto, subtitled often the Coronation Concerto. And if you think about it, of the last extraordinary round of Mozart concertos, that's the one that's performed the least. From the D minor number 20 to the B flat number 27, there's almost as if there's a little hole in number 26. It's like the old joke about how many symphonies did Tchaikovsky write? 3, 4, 5, and 6. How many last piano concertos were there of Mozart? Well, everything minus 1, because somehow this piece falls out often of the canon. Talk a little about the piece, Timo, and then how you came to it, what the impulse to collaborate in a way with Mozart, and then we'll ask you to demonstrate a little.
So I actually didn't know the Coronation Concerto at all. And then a conductor friend, I was planning a concert with a conductor friend of mine, and he kind of alerted me to the fact that there was this Mozart manuscript that was actually missing the left-hand part. Mozart wrote in all the orchestra parts and the right hand of the piano, but left most of the left hand blank. There are a few passages where he put like more complex, harmonically complex passages where he did fill it in. But Mozart wrote in a great hurry often, and it was likely that he just sort of knew what he was going to do in a performance and never got around to filling it in. And yeah, when I listened to the piece, which when you hear it most times now, it's been filled in by an editor at one of the publishing houses in a very sort of dutiful, scholarly, the fewest risks possible are taken. Well, I mean, which is fine. It's like that's the job. And so Andrew commissioned me to do my own completion, and sort of left it at that. Didn't give me any guidance, tell me what kind of style he was expecting or how faithful I should remain to the Mozart. And then so I kept listening to this piece in existing completions, and I think it's fair to say that it's not one of the great Mozart concertos. It's a very large piece, for one thing. It's quite long, and the orchestra by Mozart standards is pretty big, and it has a very sort of public feeling. It's a very it has a lot of these sort of powerful D major themes that are repeated a lot, and you don't get a whole lot of the sort of inward, like sexy, tragic Mozart that Jeremy was talking about, which is, of course, what we kind of love Mozart for. And so I, in a way, it felt like a particularly blank slate for me to do something a little bit unexpected or a little bit outre. And so what I did, I kind of took the existing manuscript as like a canvas and filled in all kinds of other music in a way that it would kind of be almost like a separate thing happening simultaneously. So the left hand of the piano comments on the existing material. It takes a lot of Mozart's themes and sort of reworks them in a much more harmonically free and extended way than he would have ever done. And also it takes sort of the history of the piano concerto subsequently. It's sort of this style that that Mozart really helped to formulate in his late concertos, of sort of the big heroic piano concerto. And so the sort of entire history of the piano concerto since then finds its way into the left hand of my piece. And the effect, it was really like, I had never done anything like this before, and I had no idea what to expect. I didn't even know, like, I was so nervous at the first rehearsal. I thought that I didn't know what the orchestra would do. I thought they might revolt or throw me out. And actually, it was funny because the commission was originally for another pianist. I was writing it for another pianist, who shall remain nameless. And he or she, actually, when he or she saw what I'd done,
Bolted?
Yeah, dropped out of the gig. And this was kind of at the last moment and left us in the lurch. And I sort of frantically called all my pianist friends, and none of them were free. And so I ended up learning it myself. And yeah, it was, it's kind of become a little bit, what's the word? Infamous?
Could you, I don't want to give away too much of the piece, but would you mind playing a little of the opening of the slow movement?
Sure.
Both in sort of harmonically standard fashion.
Yeah, it's funny.
And then in your version.
This was actually one of the passages that, when I was listening, struck me as like one of the least inspired of the existing completions, and I don't even know how they go, so I'll make something up. Mozart's theme to the second movement. And I sort of gave it kind of a little bit body, like Rachmaninoff harmonies in my version.
I had the great experience of listening. There's a wonderful recording Timo has made on None Such Records that I know is being sold at the great book and recording kiosk at the festival. And I had the unique experience of listening to it while driving up the Pacific Coast Highway on my way here. And I had not heard it. I'd heard excerpts from it, but I'd not heard it all the way through.
Did you have to pull over?
No. No, I drove safely. But there is a temptation to swerve suddenly. The one thing, I want to leave the last comment to Don because he heard a rehearsal of the piece, and to circle back to how profound our expectations of harmony are as listeners and how conditioned they are, because it's on a on one very important level, the tug of this version of the piece is about that. But Timo, before we left you, I wanted to say what struck me, among many other things, is that it's not a mustache on the Mona Lisa. It's
No,
not,
I mean, maybe in a couple of places,
It's
but-
not graffiti or disfiguring. It's a kind of dialogue.
Right. I mean, it kind of gets back to what I think is a useful way for, at least for a composer, to think about music history, which is not as a sort of teleology, as like a timeline of like kind of musical technological progress, but more as just like a pile of stuff that keeps getting bigger. And the pile at this point is so large and various that it can be quite overwhelming, actually, to sort of know, like, because when you're writing an original work, it's like, what is your place in the sort of musical firmament? And like, I grew up studying classical piano and studying all this, you know, the repertoire that Rosen wrote about, and grew up with his book on Beethoven sonatas. And that stuff is kind of the closest to my heart. So actually, I mean, some people might take it as like a middle finger or a mustache. But it actually, I have to say, it comes from this place of deep love for classical music and for Mozart and Beethoven and these composers. And I mean, I'd like to think that they would at least be amused by what I've done. I don't know what they would make of it, or what Charles Rosen would make of it, for that matter. But
Don, yes, of course.
I just wanted to say a word in relation to what Don Randall was saying. When you asked him about performer and writing, there's one thing that wasn't mentioned, which is in his relation to the scholarly world, which is the issue of hearing and listening, which I think is crucial. That is, what his critique or discomfort with a lot of critical writing on music is that it was based on looking at scores and not on listening, and making no difference between what is hearable. And by the way, that fits in with the idea that, you know, you can play the continuo as long as you don't hear it. Yeah, but for him, yeah, that was crucial. You know, what do you hear? What are the sort of acoustic relationships? And that went, I think, partly with his great concern with coloring in performance, so that you can distinguish lines and things like that. I'm sorry to...
No, please.
One of the things he said about some analytical studies of this music was that it was all very interesting, but it would be equally true if you played the piece backwards. And I remember him saying to me once something like what Henry said, that you know, the low-grade music critic goes to a concert, hardworking person, has to write in a hurry, knows that Charles has a PhD. So without hearing a note, first thing to say is, well, he's an intellectual and he plays in this very intellectual way. And Charles, it just drove him nuts, and it drove me nuts too. He said, I would rather this critic would just say, Rosen must have been nervous last night because he didn't loosen up until the third movement or something like that, rather than to say it's because he has a PhD in literature. But the thing about Timo's piece, I thought, that is so interesting, also rests in something that Charles has said, because one of the things he was criticized for in his book was that he didn't give enough attention to the many formulas in 18th century music that all these lesser composers used. I mean, lots of us could go to the piano and make a plausible 18th century sounding thing using these formulas. And Charles said, no, it's not about those formulas. And he didn't address them specifically because it was his view that it was Haydn and Mozart and Beethoven who could take that material and make something really important out of it. So it didn't rest on those formulas. It transformed those formulas into something very much greater. And so with Timo's piece, what you hear is a certain number of expectations coming from the right hand, where there are many formulas, as you say, and your experience of 18th century music leads you to expect certain kinds of things, and then you discover there are many other things that could flow from those same propositions. That is, you could take this formula and you could make it into something wholly different. In a way, what Charles was saying was that Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven made those formulas into something wholly different. And if you're in the 21st century, you can make those formulas into something wholly different still. I promise you, I heard the first movement in rehearsal this morning, my first experience of the piece. The first movement has more shocking stuff than, than you heard just now, and I promise you, you will not be able to keep from smiling a good deal of the time. But you'll also...
If you didn't hear, Timo said, that's encouraged.
Yes, it's at moments extremely witty and very stimulating all the while, and played brilliantly. It's not an easy piece to play that you have composed. Yeah, I think so.
With that thought, I think we'll take a break. I want to join you in thanking Don Randall, Timo Andrus, and Henry Zerner. We'll be back at 3 in 20 minutes.
It's not an easy flight.